I had crossed 40 years of black between the stars before a Vicini ever raised a hand to one of ours, and I want it set down plain, the way it happened, because the story got loud after, and the loud parts were mostly lies. My name is Rourke. I am old now, old enough that the young dockers call me sir without being told to, and I have buried more of my own than I care to count. But on the day I mean to tell you about I still had my son, and my son still had his daughter, and her name was Nell. Sarn's Reach was a trade ring the Vicini built out past the Ossuary drift, a great slow wheel of white metal turning against the dark, and it was beautiful the way their things were always beautiful, clean, cold, and made for hands smaller and softer than ours. The Vicini were tall and pale and moved like water poured slow. They ran the Reach the way they ran everything they touched, with ledgers and quiet voices and a certainty so deep it never had to be spoken. And they let us come there, us humans, because there was work on that ring no soft-boned species would do. We did the loading in the hard bays where the gravity ran heavy to hold the cargo down. We walked the outer spars in suits that would have crushed a Vicini's chest just by their own weight. We went into the reactor throats when the shielding cracked, and we came back out, and the ones who did not come back out we carried home ourselves and buried in the black with our own hands. The Reach ran on human backs, and everyone on it knew that, and no one who mattered ever said it out loud. They called us Deathworlders. It was not a compliment when they said it. It meant we came from a world that had tried its whole long history to kill the things living on it, a world of crushing weight and hard weather and predators that hunted in the dark, and it meant we had come up out of that furnace strange, dense in the bone, stubborn in the heart, hard to put down and harder to make afraid. To the Vicini it meant beast. It meant useful beast. They said the word the way a man says the name of a tool. I had made my peace with the word a long time before. You did not last 40 years out there by picking fights with how the soft folk saw you. You did your work, you took your pay, you kept your people close, and you let the rest of it slide off you like rain off a hull. My son Dell understood that too. His wife Marta understood it. It was the one thing we all understood, the whole human quarter of that ring. You keep your head down, you keep your people whole, and you go home. Nell was 8 years old and she did not understand it at all, and thank God for that. She had been born on a freighter between two systems, which meant by the old law she had no world at all, and she wore that like a bright coin. She was small even for a human child, all elbows and questions, with her mother's dark eyes, and a way of going still and watchful when something interested her that made grown men forget what they were saying. She had the run of the human quarter and half the run of the Reach besides, because everybody knew her, and everybody watched her without being asked, the way our people always watched the young. She was fascinated by the Vicini. That was the thing. Where the rest of us saw the soft folk and looked away, Nell looked closer. She would sit at the edge of the concourse where the Vicini took their long meals, and she would watch how they moved their long fingers, and she would try to copy it, and she would ask me at night why they never seemed to hurry. She had no fear in her of them at all. She had no fear in her of much of anything. That was the death world in her blood, I think, though she was too young for any of us to have named it yet. Warden Osek von ran the inner concourse of Sarn's Reach. I want to be fair to the dead and the disgraced both, so I will say what was true of him. He was not, by the standard of his own kind, a cruel male. He was proud, and he was certain, and he had spent his whole life among people who bent when he came near, and those three things together will hollow a man out and leave something that looks like cruelty from the outside, even when the inside never meant it. He wore the pale gray of the port wardens, and he carried the little silver rod they carried, more sign of rank than weapon, and he walked the concourse the way a landlord walks a field, seeing what was his. Human children were not, in his ordering of the world, supposed to be on the inner concourse. It was not a written rule. It was one of the 1,000 unwritten ones, the kind the soft folk knew from birth and we learned by bruising into them. The inner concourse was for the Vicini and the merchant castes and the fine folk who came through to trade. The likes of us kept to the hard bays and the human quarter and the service ways between. That was the shape of things. But Nell was 8, and there was a garden on the inner concourse. The Vicini grew a garden at the ring's hub, a real one, with living things in it under the false sun of the dome lights, pale blue growing stuff from their homeworld, and low water running over white stone, and it was the closest thing to a world that any child on that station had ever seen. Nell had found it the way she found everything, by wandering where she should not, and she had gone back to it 3 times before the day I mean to tell you about, and each time some human hand had caught her by the collar and hauled her home before the warden saw, and each time she had gone quiet and watchful and then done it again. The 4th time, no human hand was near. I was in the hard bays that shift, chained to a load-master's board with the gravity running heavy, and I did not see it. Almost none of us saw it. That is part of why the story went the way it did. There were only 3 witnesses to the thing itself, and none of them were the ones who acted. But I have heard it told by all 3 so many times that I could walk you through it breath by breath, and I will, because you should see it plain before you hear what we did. Nell was crouched at the edge of the water in the garden, very still, with one small hand held out over the running stream, watching a thing swim there. She was not touching it. She was not taking anything. She was doing the one thing my granddaughter did better than any creature I have ever known, which was to look at a thing with her whole heart until she understood it. Warden HFY came around the white stone and saw a human child in his garden. I do not think he decided anything. That is the terrible part, and the part the Vicini could never afterward make us understand they meant. He did not weigh it. To weigh a thing you have to first believe it might weigh something. He saw a beast's whelp fouling a fine place, and his long arm came around, and the back of his hand took my granddaughter across the face and knocked her off her feet and into the white stone at the edge of the water. The 3 witnesses were a Thren trader, a Vicini serving caste girl, and a boy of ours named Tam who was 9 and had followed Nell to tell her to come home. The Thren said afterward that the sound of it carried across the whole garden. The Vicini serving girl said afterward, weeping, that the warden had already turned away before Nell had finished falling, that he had struck her and forgotten her in the same motion, the way you flick a thing off your sleeve. Nell hit the stone and split her lip and cracked her small head against the edge of the watercourse, and she lay there for a moment with the false sun on her, not moving, and Tam, 9 years old, Deathworld born, small and dense and stubborn, did the one thing his blood told him to do. He did not shout at the warden. He did not run at the warden. He knelt down over Nell so that his own body was between her and the tall, pale male, and he looked up at Warden HFY with a 9-year-old's face gone to stone, and he did not make a sound, and he did not move. That was the first thing. A child of ours putting his body between the soft folk and a smaller child in perfect silence. The Vicini serving girl said it was that, more than the blow, that she could not forget. She said she had never in her life seen so young a creature go so still, and so certain, and so unafraid. Then Tam picked Nell up. She was coming round by then, one hand at her bleeding mouth, her dark eyes wide and wet and furious. And he carried her out of the garden and down the service way, and word went ahead of them faster than their feet could carry it, the way word always did among us. And by the time they reached the human quarter I already knew, chained to my board 4 decks down in the heavy gravity, that a Vicini warden had struck my granddaughter's face. I remember the load master's board under my hands. I remember the weight of the false gravity in my chest. I remember that I did not stand up right away. And I want you to understand why, because it is the whole heart of the thing. I did not stand up right away because I was old, and because I had crossed 40 years of black, and because in that first white moment I knew, the way you know a wall is coming in the dark, that if I stood up wrong, if I stood up in anger, if I stood up to break something, then I would give them the story they already believed. The savage, the beast that could not be led among fine things, the Deathworlder who proved with his own hands that everything they said of us was true. So I sat with the weight in my chest and I made myself breathe, and I thought of my son, and I thought of what we were going to do instead. And even then, 4 decks down, before I had said a word to a living soul, I already knew what we were going to do, because it was written in all of us so deep that it did not need deciding. It was the Deathworld thing. It was the oldest thing we carried up out of that furnace of a world. We were going to stop. You have to understand what it is to be needed and despised at once. It is a particular kind of knowledge, and it settles into a people over generations, and it teaches them a particular kind of patience. The Vicini needed us. Not liked us, needed us. The way a body needs the blood it does not think about. Everything on Sarn's reach that was hard or heavy or dangerous or done in the dark where the machines failed was done by human hands. And because they never had to think about their blood, they never once thought about what would happen if it stopped. I climbed out of the hard bay, and I did not run and I did not shout. I walked to the human quarter, and by the time I got there my son Dell was already sitting in our compartment with Nell held against his chest and Marta's arms around them both. And the station doctor of ours, a quiet man named Yusuf, was cleaning the split in my granddaughter's lip with hands that did not shake though his jaw was set like iron. Nell was awake. She was awake and she was angry and she was ashamed, the way a child is ashamed when a large thing has hurt them and made them small, and that shame was the thing I could not bear, worse than the blood. She looked up at me over Yusuf's shoulder and her eyes filled and she said, "I wasn't taking anything, Pop. I was just looking." "I know it," I said. "I know you were." "I wasn't doing anything wrong." "No," I said, "you weren't." And I looked at my son over her head, and my son looked at me, and neither of us said the word, because the word did not need saying. He tightened his arms around his daughter and he gave me one short nod, and I went back out to do the thing that our people do when one of theirs is struck, the thing 40 light-years of empire had never once seen us do and never understood until it was far too late. I went and I told them, ship to ship, that we were done working the reach until the child had her justice. Not vengeance. I want that word gone from this the way we kept it gone from that. We did not want the warden's blood. If we had wanted his blood, we could have had it in an hour and lost everything doing it, and every human on that ring knew it, and not one of us reached for it. What we wanted was harder than blood and slower, and it frightened them far more, because blood they understood. Blood was a thing their laws knew how to answer. A whole people going quiet and still and refusing to move, until a wrong was set right on the record, that they had no answer for at all. The word moved through the human quarter and out along the docking spars and into the freighters clamped to the ring, and by the end of that first shift every human on Sarn's reach had set down their tools. Not one bay loaded. Not one spar walked. Not one reactor throat watched. We did not gather in crowds. Crowds are what the soft folk fear, and fear makes them foolish, and we did not want them foolish. We wanted them clear-eyed and afraid in the deep quiet way that lasts. We went to our compartments and our ships, and we sat with our own, and we waited. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the patience of my people. It is the thing the histories miss. They write about the strength of our bodies and the hardness of our world, and those are real, but they are not the Deathworld's true gift. The true gift is that a world which spends 1,000,000,000 years trying to kill you teaches you, in the marrow, that you cannot win by being loud or fast or fierce in the moment. You win by outlasting. By enduring past the point where anything softer would have broken and moved on. By holding a thing, a grief, a debt, a wrong done to your young and not setting it down ever until it is answered. The Vicini could out-argue us and outspend us and outvote us in any council in the galaxy. They could not outweight us. Nothing can. That is what it means to come from a world that wanted you dead. You learn to want a thing longer than the thing that wants you dead can hold out. By the second shift, the administration understood that the docks had stopped, and they did what I knew they would do. They sent a functionary. He was a mid-caste Vicini named Ser Alan, a clerk of the Port Authority, and he came to the edge of the human quarter in his clean gray with 2 others behind him, and he was afraid, and he hid it well, and he asked to speak to whoever led us. None of us led us. That was another thing they never grasped. There was no boss to buy, no chief to threaten, no single throat to put a hand around. But we had our ways, and our ways sent me, because I was old and I had crossed 40 years of black and my granddaughter was the one who had been struck. I went out to meet him with my son beside me, and I stood in front of the clerk and I let the silence stretch until it was his to break, because a Vicini cannot bear a silence the way we can. It is one more thing their soft world never taught them. There has been an incident, Sir Alan said at last. The Port Authority regrets the incident. The child's family will be compensated, generously. He named a figure. It was a great deal of money. It was more money than my son would earn in 10 years walking the spars. The docks will resume operation immediately. This is the resolution. I let another silence go by. Then I said no. He blinked his pale, slow eyes. The compensation can be increased. There is no number, I said. You have misunderstood us, and I am going to help you understand once plainly, so that no one on either side can say afterward it was not said plainly. We do not want your money. A man does not sell the face of his granddaughter. You have offered to buy a thing that is not for sale, and every time you name a higher number you tell us more clearly that you think it is. So stop nomming numbers. Then what? He said, and there was the first real fear under it now, the fear of a man who has run out of the one tool he was sent with. Then what is it you want? Justice, I said, by your own charter, not ours, yours, the one hanging on the wall of your own council hall that you wrote that says every soul aboard this ring stands equal before it. Warden Ossuary struck a child who was doing no wrong and took no thing, struck her hard enough to lay her open on the stone, and turned away without a backward look. We want him brought before the charter you wrote, and we want him made to answer for it in the open, before the child, before the whole reach, on the record where it cannot be unwritten. That is all. That is everything. And until it is done, not one human hand will lift 1 gram of cargo on this ring, and you may increase that figure all you like. Sir Alan stood very still, and I watched the size of the thing arrive in him, because he understood, as I meant him to, that the charter was the trap, and that we had not built it, they had. It hung on their own wall. Their fine words about every soul standing equal had been written to make themselves feel just, never once meant to be turned and held against one of their own on behalf of a beast's whelp. And now here we were, refusing their money, asking for nothing but the thing they claimed to already believe, and they could not give it to us without admitting that a warden of the port had done a real wrong to a real person, and they could not refuse it without tearing their own charter off their own wall in front of every trader and merchant, and passing dignitary on the reach. That is not, he said, and stopped and started again. The warden acted within. Then say so at the hearing, said my son. It was the first thing Dell had said, and his voice was very quiet, and the clerk flinched from it. Say so on the record. Stand him up before the charter and let him say to my daughter's face that he acted within his rights when he laid her open on the stone, if your charter agrees with him. Then he walks free and clean and we go back to work in the morning and you have lost nothing. But you will say it in the open. That is all we ask. Are you afraid to? And there it was, the thing hanging between us in the clean, cold air of Sarn's reach. The certainty that if they put it in the open, in front of the whole ring, before all the other soft folk who traded there and watched and would carry the tale outward, their charter would not agree with him. Because a Vicini will do a great many quiet cruelties, but he will not, in the open, before witnesses, defend the striking of a child. Their whole civilization was built on the pretense of being better than that. The pretense was the trap. We only asked them to be, out loud, what they had always claimed to be. Sir Alan went away, and the dock stayed silent, and Sarn's reach began to die. I want you to understand how a place like that dies, because it does not die in fire. It dies in stillness. The cargo the ring lived on stopped moving. The merchant ships that came expecting fast turnaround sat clamped and idle, burning their reserves, their captains growing first impatient and then curious and then, one by one, informed of exactly why nothing was moving. Because a warden struck a human child, and now the Deathworlders will not lift a gram until it is answered. And the merchants, who were of a dozen soft species and none, sat in their idle ships and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic frightened them worse than any riot could have. Because a riot ends. A riot burns hot and then it burns out, and then the wardens sweep the ash and the ledgers balance again. But a people who will simply, quietly, patiently stop, who will lose their own wages, empty their own larders, sit in the cold and the dark holding a single wrong and refusing to set it down, a people like that cannot be swept up, because there is no fire to put out. There is only the terrible steady weight of them, waiting. And the merchants, watching the humans wait, understood for the first time the thing the Vicini had never let themselves think, that the reason you did not truly want to make an enemy of a Deathworlder was not that he would kill you in his anger. It was that he would outlast you in his patience, that he would remember the wrong when your grandchildren had forgotten your name, that some furnace of a birthworld had burned every ounce of quit out of him, 100,000 years before your soft people ever climbed down out of your comfortable trees. By the fourth shift, the great garden at the hub of the ring had begun to wilt, because it was tended by human hands too, and no human hand was tending it. And I have always thought there was a justice in that their one small piece of a living world began to die the same slow, quiet death as the rest of the reach, for the same reason, because a warden could not keep his hand to himself before a child who only wanted to look at it. They held out 6 shifts of a dying station, of idle merchants and burning reserves and a wilting garden and a whole silent human quarter that would not break. And on the 7th shift, the Port Authority of Sarn's Reach announced that Warden HFY would answer for his conduct before the Charter, in open hearing, in the council hall, on the record, before the child and her family and any soul of the ring who cared to witness. We had won the thing we came for, but we had not yet seen the true shape of the win, and neither had they, and neither, I think, had the warden himself. The council hall of Sarn's Reach was the finest room I ever stood in, and I have stood in a few. It rose the full height of the hub in white stone and pale light, and their charter was carved into the far wall in their flowing script, and in the common tongue beneath it. Every soul aboard this ring stands equal before this law, and it filled the hall gathered there the way I have never seen a room fill before or since. Because it was not only Vicini. That was the thing none of them had reckoned. The merchants came, all of them, the Thren and the bow folk and the shelled traders from the rim and a dozen kinds I had no name for, because they had all been sitting idle in their ships for 7 shifts learning exactly why, and now they had come to see how it ended. And the humans came, every one of us, the whole quarter, dockers and freighter crews and old Yusuf the doctor and the boy Tam who had knelt over Nell in the garden, and we did not fill the hall with noise. We filled it with stillness. We stood along the walls and in the rows, and we were quiet, all of us, hundreds of us, and I have been told by more than one of the soft folk who was there that day that nothing in their long, soft lives had ever frightened them so much as a human crowd that made no sound. Warden HFY was brought to stand before the charter, and he stood there in his clean gray without his silver rod, and for the first time I saw that he was afraid, and I felt no triumph in it, only a great tiredness. And then they brought Nell forward. We had talked about that, her mother and father and I, whether to bring her at all, whether a child should have to stand in that great cold room before the thing that had struck her. And in the end it was Nell who settled it, because she said she wanted to, and she said it in that still watchful way of hers that brooked no arguing. And Marta looked at me and I looked at Dell, and we let her, because she was Deathworld born and it was hers to do. She walked out into the center of that white hall, 8 years old and small even for that, her lips still split and dark, and she stood in front of Warden HFY and she looked up at him, and she was not afraid. I watched for the fear and it was not there. She looked up at the tall, pale male who had knocked her off her feet, and the whole hall held its breath, and my granddaughter said, in a clear, small voice that carried to the carved words on the far wall, "I wasn't taking anything, I was just looking at it. I think it was beautiful, I would never have hurt it." That was all. She did not accuse him. She did not curse him. She told him, simply, the thing she had told me in the compartment with the blood still on her mouth, that she had done no wrong, that she had only wanted to see a beautiful thing, that she would never have harmed it. She gave him, in the middle of that great hall, before his whole people and a dozen others, the plain truth of a child, and she let it stand there in the open where he could not turn away from it as he had turned away in the garden. And Warden HFY, who had struck her without weighing it, who had flicked her off his sleeve and forgotten her in the same motion, looked down at the small, dense, unafraid child, telling him she had only wanted to look at something beautiful, and something in him came apart. I saw it happen. I was close enough to see it. I watched the certainty go out of him, the certainty that had let him strike her, the great soft lifelong certainty that a human child was a beast's whelp and not a person at all. It went out of him all at once, the way air goes out of a breached hull, and what was left when it was gone was a man who had done a terrible small thing to a real child and could no longer pretend to himself that he had not. He had needed her to be a beast. She had refused, gently, in front of everyone, simply by being a child who thought a swimming thing was beautiful, and it broke him more thoroughly than any hand of ours could have. He did not defend himself. When the charter's speaker asked him to answer for his conduct, he did not say he had acted within his rights. He stood in front of the carved words that said every soul aboard this ring stands equal before this law, and he stood in front of the child and he said, very low, that he had struck her, and that she had done no wrong, and that he had no defense. They stripped him of the gray that day. Not to please us, I want that clear, but because once he had said it in the open, before all those witnesses, before the merchants who would carry it outward to every port on the drift, their charter left them no other road. Their own fine words, carved on their own wall, turned in their hands and gave the verdict for them. Warden HFY was broken from the port authority, entered into the record as having struck a child unprovoked, and set down among the lowest castes to live out his years knowing what he was. It was not blood. It was worse than blood for a proud man. It was the truth of himself made permanent on the record, where he could never unwrite it and never turn away. And then we went back to work. That is the part the loud tellings always leave out, and it is the part that matters most, so I will set it down last and plain. The morning after the hearing, every human hand on Sarn's Reach picked up its tools and went back into the hard bays and out along the spars and down into the reactor throats, exactly as before. We loaded the cargo. We walked the weight. We tended their wilting garden until it came green again. We asked for nothing more. We did not lord it over them, or press the advantage, or squeeze the frightened administration for 1 gram beyond the single thing we had come for. We had wanted justice for the child, and we had gotten it on the record in the open, and that was the whole of what we wanted, and having it, we simply went back to being what we had always been. The backs the Reach ran on, quiet and steady and easy to overlook. But they never overlooked us the same way again. That was the change, and it went outward from Sarn's Reach along every trade lane the idle merchants sailed, and it did not sound the way the histories say. The histories say the galaxy learned to fear human strength. That is not it. They already knew we were strong. What they learned at Sarn's Reach and could not unlearn was something quieter and far more lasting. They learned that you could work us and despise us and step over us for 100 years and we would bear it. But that if you ever, in your soft certainty, raised your hand to one of our young, you had better be ready to lose everything and wait forever, because we would ask for nothing but justice, and we would not be loud about it, and we would not be quick, and we would not ever, no matter the cost to ourselves, set it down. That the Deathworld's true gift was not the strength to break you. It was the patience to outlast you. And that there is nothing in all the soft, cold reaches of the black so terrible as a people who will quietly refuse to move until a wrong done to their child is made right. Nell is grown now, with children of her own, born like her between the stars with no world to call their own. She does not remember the garden well, she tells me. She was too young. But she remembers standing in the great white hall and telling the tall pale male the truth, and she remembers that the whole room went still to hear an 8-year-old say she had only wanted to look at something beautiful. I told her the last time she asked me about it, the thing I most want you to carry away from this, and I will end on it, because it is the only lesson worth the telling. I told her that we did not win that day because we were strong. Strong is common. Every furnace of a world makes something strong, and then the world grinds it down again. We won because we would not stop, and we would not sell her face, and we would not, in our anger, become the beast they needed us to be. We won by being patient past all their power to endure, and gentle past all their power to shame, and by holding one small true thing, that a child had done no wrong, and refusing to let it go until the whole galaxy agreed. That is the death world, not the hardness of the bone, the refusal of the heart to ever set its young down. They struck one of our children once, out past the ossuary drift. They did not do it twice,